Okay, so this is the last presentation of the day, so I think I'll take off after this. My presentation is on supporting open source software, and I'm comparing the support of practices of supporting open source software versus proprietary software. I am an AP here at MSU, and I've worked with open source pretty much my entire career here at MSU. I started off in the CAPA project, which later became the Long CAPA project. From there, I moved over to the instructional systems team in what is now IT services. I got to work with Moodle for a year or two, and during the reorg, I was moved over to this new division called Content and Collaboration, and I'm working now with University Archives, and I get to touch with some of open source software again. So I have a pretty strong background in it. I use Linux at work as my main desktop, and I use Linux at home. I've also, in the past, I haven't recently, but years ago I used to sit on the GLUG list, which is Greater Lansing Linux Users Group. And there's also a list called Linux Chicks, which is a group of women who use Linux, which is pretty a fun group, a supporting group. So that gives you some background of where I come from with open source. So my outline for today's talk is I'm going to cover these topics. One, I'm going to start with just the background on what is free and open source software. We might move so fast through this. I think a lot of you know this, will know that. Then I'm going to compare the free and open source software to proprietary software and compare some differences. From there, I'm going to take those comparisons and show what the support differences are. I'm going to take those comparisons again and show how you can even boost the support up more by becoming what I'm calling like a citizen of the open source software community. And then I'll have some, hopefully maybe have some time for questions. So I'm going to start now with part one, which is the background on open source software. So the first thing is, what does open source software mean? And there's two things that go on with open source software. Is one, the code is available for you to read if you own the software, but there's usually some sort of restriction put on the code as well, that if you can see the code and you edit the code and you go to publish that code, you have to publish with all of your new edits with it. I kind of feel bad that Brendan called that a virus. I thought that was kind of a negative term. I thought it was a way of preserving and sustaining the openness is what I will rename that instead of a virus. I have some examples of open source software, just list them here. Again, this community is going to know a lot of this, but I'll just cover some. The Firefox web browser, Linux operating system, the wonderful Horde email client we have here at MSU, the Apache web server is very popular. I think that might be one of the most popular open source projects. And then, again, my background before I moved into collaborative content and collaboration was with learning management systems, and so I have a lot of those examples in here. So Long CAPA, Moodle, and Sakai. And then there's a version of Canvas, which is AGPL, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. The WordPress blog software, Drupal, and MediaWiki, which is where Wikipedia is based off of. And so those are some web tools that a lot of you will probably be familiar with. I'm going to step back with my example of Long CAPA, and this kind of goes back to what the first talk with Brendan. So MSU owns the copyright of Long CAPA, but as the copyright owner, we were able to grant, put Long CAPA under GPL. So that's just, like I said, I wanted to go kind of quickly through that. I figure this community kind of knows this stuff already. Now what I want to hit on is the comparison between proprietary software and open source software. So I broke them down into a few categories here. Should have put a table on here. But I'm going to start off with the requirements, so the requirements gathering phase. So in proprietary software, there's considerable effort put in requirements gathering. There's usually a project manager. Management makes change decisions, and the coders are just a part of that project. Now, that can also happen in open source software. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, But it's also common in when you have open source software that the users of the software are also the developers. It could also be the managers or the managing the project too. And so what I said is users who do not contribute code can communicate with the programmers on mailing lists, but they don't really have a say, like have purchased a license and then can go to the management or anything like that. And so users, to influence the requirement gathering, have to find these outlets to go in there, and I'll talk about how you can get to that later. Again, next thing after requirements is the work assignments. A proprietary software is usually assigned by management, whereas a free and open source software can be chosen by programmers. And I would even say when a traditional management structure makes something open source, something always seems to change. It gets a little more open and free, and I think even then people tend to kind of choose to where they want to go, is from what my experience. I mean, there's still some say with management, but I see people kind of pick on like, oh, well, this looked good, I'm going to add this to it, especially if they enjoy their work. In the software process, could be formal evaluation processes throughout a development timeline, where in free and open source software, the community chooses which contributions to make official. And from there, anyone can spin off their new community. And so having consensus within a community is very important in the software process for open source software. Next thing I was going to compare is the incentive structure. So again, we have profit-driven versus a complex set of motives for open source software. And this was brought up by both Jeff and Dean. Both of them brought up kind of an altruistic motives. They wanted to see their software get used, and they wanted it to be affordable. And so that meant very much, that was such a strong motive for them that's why open source was chosen. Again, the comparison of management structures. And this one, I've had people who've had a strong background in open source software kind of say they've learned something new from this, is you have a business management structure with open source software. In the free and open source software communities, there's different structures. You have what could be a traditional business management structure a bit more. For example, Red Hat. So Red Hat is a business, they have their own structure, and they have open source that they grab from other projects, but they have a company that makes decisions in that. So that one kind of follows along some of the more traditional routes of a proprietary software company. But then you have other kind of governments within software communities. So for example, the Debian project actually has a constitution. They're, I don't know if you ever go and read or go and look at some of the Debian software community and that. You have to really know the rules and stuff in that community. Then you have this consortium foundation type government. And it was brought up earlier with Brendan that Quali isn't, I guess, truly open source. I didn't know that, but by having a membership in that, you can get to the source code. Long Kappa and the Sakai project, again, those are learning management systems. They have a consortium that people can join, put some effort in, and that joining the consortium and putting some resources towards the consortium gives you a bigger say in the development and direction of the project. You have some projects which is called the benevolent dictator. Moodle is a good example of this. I think they're maybe trying to get away more to a foundation there, but you have one person who invented created the software, and he kind of makes the final say on where things go. You can try to influence as best as you can. I did sit next to him on a bus on a way to a tour for an Amish dinner in Indiana. Didn't help at all. But that's about all you can do with the benevolent dictator. And then there's management through tool mediation, and that kind of touches all of these things, but that's a very important point, that management will sometimes happen through, say you write a bug, the bug gets noted by enough people as being of a high priority, then that becomes a direction of the software and where it will go. An enhancement request can be the same way. If enough people can vote on it, or enough enhancements are duplicates of another, it starts growing. And so you'll have management that uses tools that kind of make those decision processes. And that was the next slide too, is tool mediation kind of going on. It's almost a defining trait of the free and open source software. You're going to always have listservs, I'm calling that a tool, Bugzilla, big one, bug reporting tools, and things like that. Dean mentioned SourceForge, and that has some of those tools built in on it where you can you know, download it, probably give some feedback in that. I haven't checked my SourceForge account in a while, but the tool mediation gives the ability to shift policy enforcement from people to tools, and so I think it kind of has this feeling that's a bit more democratic and open by having the tool mediation versus like one, you know, the man in charge or something. So sorry I've gone kind of fast. I just wanted to get through this with some limited time. So on part 3, I'm going to go through these same topics again, but talk how you can use that knowledge that I just told of the differences in your support practices. And by what I mean support practice is, for example, when I worked for Long Kappa, I supported the user community. I would be the person that someone would contact when they needed help with the system, kind of help desk. I did some training. I also did, from there, I went and did some, you know, mock-ups of design, usability, things like that. I did the same thing with Moodle, and I wanted to say how you can navigate that, so just not being a user, but you're kind of a super user because you're supporting other users. So again, just recapping, those were the topics I covered: the requirements, work assignments, tool compatibility, software processes, incentive structure, management. And I want to talk about how do those practices affect our support. So go to the requirements piece here. So let me get this on here. So support staff has to customize the software to, or convince the community to meet their needs. So that's the only 2 ways of affecting it. So the pros are the community structure is open to all users, including your the staff and faculty, to provide feedback. And so what can happen that's kind of different than proprietary software, and I've noticed people who've only had a background with proprietary software, is that their users can not go to you. They might go directly to the community and submit a bug report that way, or go right to the community and get support and then come back to you with that. And that's because of the openness. So that's something to look at. The cons are there's no formal requirements gathering. Means it kind of develops organically because you have this openness. People can kind of grow and, you know, weave their way through these communities in ways you might not expect. I'm not going to make a judgment call right now. If I won't get into that too much. I mostly think that's positive, but we may talk about that more later. The work assignments, again, you can the pros is you can customize open source, but then you need resources to code customization. And so I kind of brought up earlier is that open source software isn't really free because you're going to have to put money behind it. And because, and so I kind of put in there to make sure to play nice, because if you're not contributing code and you're using the code, then you want to at least be liked by the people who are developing the code, so maybe you'll get some help that way. So for the software processes, this is where changes occur and how you can direct that. So the community chooses which contributions to make official. So if you're using a software tool and you make a change to it, you might be supporting that change forever if they don't make it official. So that kind of happened in my group. We have this tool called RackMonkey, which just lets you keep track of the servers you own and kind of map them in the racks. So it's a nice little tool. And I forget what was missing. It was like there wasn't a field to put like an IP address or something really basic. So one of the programmers I worked for, he just added that field. It was pretty simple. But it didn't, the guy who was in charge of RackMonkey on SourceForge, we sent him the code, and he's like, oh, that's great, but I don't really have time to do anything with it. And so nothing really happened with it. So that meant if any updates occurred, because he didn't feel like integrating that in, he probably didn't have time. I shouldn't say he shouldn't feel, they didn't want to do that. That meant we would have to keep supporting that. And so it's kind of best to try to figure out a way to get that, the changes you make, to actually become part of the official release. If not, not only you have to do the changes, you have to maintain those changes over the long run. And so what I'm suggesting is for support practices is to really get to know the community and try to influence those changes. And again, going back to the incentive structure, you have to kind of use the knowledge of the incentive structure to your benefit. And so your participation in the community kind of gives you some currency in that community. And so if you want to affect changes, if you find something you don't like and just maybe go on an email list and just complain about it, that's not going to be as helpful as maybe writing a good bug report that describes how to duplicate the bug. On top of that, what even be better is maybe even fixing that bug, or at least finding the part of the code that has the problem. So the deeper you get involved, the better. And so you really want to use that to your advantage when you're supporting these. I don't really do that much coding, and I found that reporting good bug reports was has helped me kind of win my case. Not just having a bug report. What I find has been very, very helpful is showing how to reproduce that bug report. So I would really, just knock at it over and over again until I found out what are the cases that make this bug reproducible, and then put that in the report. And that's, I think, has helped me kind of see the things I've reported get in there more. On top of that, there's kind of some voting in that. So you can go on a listserv, someone could say, hey, I really like this enhancement, and then people kind of vote. And I kind of say it's kind of similar to the eBay example. People kind of go in and they're always like, I really like this, I like this. And so being involved in the community, even if you don't code or even have trouble with a bug report, just kind of talking, being involved does have some merits. I'm not turning that down. So again, just to summarize, anything you do within the community is going to be helpful. Coding is best, but anything you can do is going to contribute to changing the community's minds and therefore the software. So again, the management, it's good to learn the management style. If you know there's a consortium, if there's a way for MSU or something to get involved in that consortium, that could be helpful. And there's sometimes different levels of involvement, finding other ways to partner with other schools that are using it. So look into how that government is arranged. Is it a foundation? Is it a consortium? Is it just one dictator person? The guy who does I think it's the guy who does the web development Firefox plugin, he has like an Amazon buy me something if you really like this plugin. So I mean, there is different ways to learn, find out what the management style is, and see where that leadership is, and learn maybe how you can influence it. And again, the tool mediation. Like I said before, anyone can report bugs. So the faculty and students and staff that you might be supporting, they can go in and report a bug. It's just something to be aware of. There's listservs, and then there's the wikis, and get involved with all of that. When I was in the Moodle project, I went in actually on their wiki and updated some of the documentation when it came out. And from there, I learned that there was Moodle testers and got involved with that. So I was able in a short time span to kind of make some connections with some of the leaders in that community. So that's just kind of the support. What I want to talk about now is bringing that up one other level, and that's kind of becoming part of the citizenship of it. So what I was just saying is persuasion and mediation in the community, that's worth money. That is the money in a lot of these cases. And the next suggestion I'm going to say is to encourage faculty and staff to work with you to work with the community, so you can write the really good bug reports. I think it's great that you can go directly. In some ways it's nice that it's so open you can go directly, but if you're an IT professional, you can write a better bug report than probably a lot of them can. So encourage them, and that means you have to get involved with the community in order to utilize that. But at the same time, I would encourage the users of the tool to be involved with other ways, such as attending conferences, giving presentations. My guess is Dean probably really likes it if someone uses Cora and then gives a presentation on Cora. That's like free marketing to him. And so something like that is very helpful. And that's not a coder, that's just a user of the tool, and they've just contributed to the system. So that's a good way to kind of, and if that institution is doing that, my guess is Dean might have, they might have his ear a little bit more, you know? So, and the other thing is to encourage end users to contribute enhancement requests and to really get in the spirit of what open source is. A lot of people don't realize that, you know, you open up a project with open source and you can actually make these suggestions. And once they see these, that you can do these suggestions and vote on it, sometimes the users get much more involved with the project. And I would suggest pushing that forward. Going on, so these are just some personal examples from past experience. Is don't give up. So I've had times where I would report a bug and they would mark it as resolved, and then I'd look and it was resolved because it was a duplicate of another bug or something like that. The other thing is, like I've said before, to give reproducible examples. I found that that's one of the best of maybe entry-level type technological skill you can kind of get into. So you're not necessarily coding, but finding that reproducible example has been very helpful. The next thing I learned, a lesson, is use pictures. I did one bug, I remember, I reported a bug, and I actually saved the page and changed the CSS a little bit to show why it was, the usability was really off, and I just wanted to fix that. So I changed the CSS, sent it back, and the programmer took it as his CSS was wrong, and what I did was a bunch of crap, and got really kind of like, this, I can't put this in here, and that wasn't my intention at all. I wasn't even trying to be a web coder. I was just trying to showcase. It was something like moving the location of a button so it flowed. It was a simple change. What I've learned is to do mock-ups. And that's been super helpful. One, you're just giving them an image of what it looks like. You're not saying their code is bad or anything like that. And a lot of times the programmers want the users to give feedback and see that it's being used. So I've always had positive experiences from doing mock-ups. I'll take a screenshot of the page and then just cut and paste, move boxes around and stuff, and usually use the same interface they have and just tweak it a bit, submit that back. And I've seen, it's kind of interesting then to see a later version come out and see this interface change that I kind of had a part in. And it's just been, you know, using, you know, cut and paste off of you know, an image program. So next thing is don't get too emotionally involved. Sometimes I haven't had too much problem with this, but sometimes someone will get really adamant and get something, and you're touching, like that case with the CSS, it had nothing to do with me suggesting that, so I had to kind of step back and realize where the issue was and then use a picture. The same thing I was saying is be the good cop. I've had a programmer who owned a bug would say why he isn't going to do it this way. Well, I would reiterate why I understand what he or she is saying, and then explain why I would suggest my changes without kind of just saying, you're wrong, you suck. You'll see that in some bug reports, which I don't understand how people think that's a great idea whatsoever to do that. Whenever the actual owner goes into a bug report and comments, that's what I really want to look for, because I want to see what, you know, what they're saying, and maybe that's where there's some negotiation room in there. Again, show appreciation. like the web developer guy actually did, just said, hey, this is a great project, and that, I think it was probably a good thing. And as a last resort, this is just me being funny, is recruit trolls. Not, Jeff's Drawbridge company, but he's not here to get my joke. But so this is a little off topic, but there's this classic bug report in Red Hat with a where the guy who reported it and the bug owner just kept closing it, reopen it, closing it, reopen it, because they were arguing so much. And it got like on some forum or some, something like Dig or something like that. And it just went crazy. Some trolls got involved. The guy eventually fixed it 2 years later after he just went away for 23 months and then came back. And so it did work. What I would suggest instead, what would have probably been a better idea, is to actually find out, because if you read this bug report, and I can give anyone the link if they want to see, if you read the bug report, it's a misunderstanding of what the guy wants and what the programmer is reading. It has nothing to do with a bad bug. And in those cases, what I would suggest is look in other routes, because in a bug report, you have a time to put some comments and some time back. You're not really having a great conversation. Usually a lot of tools will have like an IRC chat room. Sometimes they will have some managers in charge, and so you can sometimes find some of that stuff and look for that person and contact them offline without it being public record. Find an IRC chat room and maybe clear some stuff up and word it better and things like that. I wouldn't take it to this level unless I tried all those other routes first. So again, another suggestion, share, share, share. And this is one of the things I want to say is management as just an AP. The management really has to encourage sharing. And as support staff, you have to be encouraged to share, because if not, you're just going to use the product and you're not going to really have much say over it. You're not going to have any influence because you're not sharing back with the community. So I was very fortunate when I worked with LongCap, I worked directly with that project. And then when I worked with Moodle, I was very encouraged and was allowed to use some of my time to, instead of just writing, if I found an error in their documentation, I would go and correct it, and that help me know someone in charge there with Moodle and stuff like that. So, I mean, just little minor changes. I don't want to make it sound like I wrote a bunch of it wasn't like that at all. But just those little fixes and having that encouragement behind me, I think really kind of helped a lot. And it really kind of was able to allow not just me, but MSU to have a little bit more influence. And so the more management can encourage everyone to share, I think it's better. And I think, so this is just my kind of, on my soapbox here saying, if someone is a manager of IT staff, that they should really encourage them to do this and to see, and then when you get to help someone else, you get more back than that. So, just something I'd really like to suggest. Again, show appreciation. I kind of covered this before. Contribute testimonials, volunteer to give presentations. That's another way to get involved. Moodle and LongCap both, for example, had conferences. Go and give a presentation at one of those conferences. Even if you're not coding, being able to show creative ways of using that software is going to really help in your persuasion of the future development of that software, because you now have kind of a place in that community somewhere. So that's my conclusion. So I just want some time for questions and comments, if anyone has anything. Well, we're a minute over. Well, if anyone wants to contact me offline, you can contact the WebDevCafe or contact Bert, and I'll be available after this talk. Some interesting things I want to say is, like I brought up that one interesting bug report. The other one I didn't bring up is there's a whole website called Geek Feminism, where they even talk about the idea of the meritocracy that goes on in open source software communities, and kind of try to analyze that. So there's some kind of fun stuff there too. for all your intellectual debating desires, I guess.
Join me in thanking you.